make of these latest unemployment figures then?
Good morning. Well, I would say that we do need to ensure that we treat these figures with a degree of caution. It's very difficult to gather up-to-date information about exactly what's happening with employment, but that figure of the loss of 2/3 people working is concerning. There seem to be different things going on around who's then starting to claim unemployment support through the universal credit system. One thing that does seem to be happening is we seem to find more people becoming economically inactive, so they're not looking for work, or indeed having that interaction with the social security system. We also seem to see quite a big reduction in the number of hours that people work. Now, clearly, in every case, this is going to be very difficult for people to deal with. It will result in a substantial reduction in their income, and we need to be doing all that we can to try and keep those unemployment numbers and the reduction in hours to as low as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, because we know that nearly a third of UK firms are planning to axe jobs in the next 3 months, so the number of unemployed is likely to go up. And as you say, there's a considerable number of people, according to this latest unemployment figures, that people are not working any hours, they're not getting pay, but they're not actually looking for a job because of the circumstances at the moment. So again, we're likely to see unemployment go up. What measures would you be taking to try to ensure that the impact of this is minimised? How can we keep people in the workforce? How can we try to see off the crisis that's looming?
Well, there are some measures that the Chancellor announced last week, which we were broadly supportive of, that we called for. So we did say there needed to be a special programme for young unemployed people. It's particularly challenging for them. Often they obviously won't have any work experience, etc., to demonstrate. So we said there needed to be a targeted programme, like what Labour's running in Wales right now, to help those young people speedily back into work. Government's announced what they've called the Kickstarter scheme. Now, we really need to make sure that they're new opportunities, that they're not just going to result in young workers being substituted for older workers. But it is positive that we seem to see some shift from government in that regard. But we think the really big challenge now is actually about the withdrawal of the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme, and the self-employed scheme. We've urged the Chancellor not to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to this. We still see, in fact, a number of people not able to work. Their sectors are still closed for understandable public health reasons, and yet the support is being withdrawn from them. We think that actually in the long run, doing that will be expensive because it will push up unemployment, and that then has a very, very major impact on people's earning potential for the future.
Anneliese, how long would you keep the furlough scheme going for, though? At some point, it has to end, doesn't it?
Well, we don't think it should continue in its current format. We do think that it needs to become much, much more targeted. But then that support needs to be linked to the challenges that different sectors are facing. And, this is how we're seeing these kinds of schemes adapt in other countries. So, you could look at the German case, for example, or the French case. They've continued forms of effectively backfilling wages for some groups of different workers in order to ensure that they're not then falling into that pool of unemployed people. Yes, it does mean that you continue expenditure in that part of the scheme, albeit a reformed part of the scheme into subsequent months. But that would save any money that's then spent on unemployment support. And in addition, the Chancellor's just announced this bonus for employers who keep staff on. That's not a particularly targeted measure. I haven't found any employers really saying this is going to incentivise them to keep staff on. Something that's more targeted would work a lot better here.
What do you mean by that? When you say more targeted, sorry, Charlotte, when you mean more targeted, targeted to whom and for how long?
So the Chancellor announced last week a bonus for every employer who takes back into full employment somebody who was on the furlough scheme. That's £1,000 for every single employee. Now, that will obviously mean quite a lot of money going to some employers. It's not clear if any conditions will be placed on that. It could be, for example, unless conditions are placed on it, that we could see very rapidly those employees being let go of. It's not linked to the challenges that different firms are facing. We've said to government, look, please, actually focus in on those areas where employers are really struggling, where they could potentially have a viable long-term future, but where they just simply do not have the cash flow right now to be paying an additional employer contribution. We can think about different sectors, whether they be those like, for example, the beauty industry, personal trainers, etc., those who literally are not allowed to work currently to the extent that they were before, withdrawing support from them at the same rate as every other type of sector just simply doesn't make sense.
Do you have any sympathy for Rishi Sunak at the moment? I mean, he's very popular. A recent poll put him way ahead of you, for example, in terms of popularity with the public. I mean, it's a difficult job he's got. In many ways, it's almost a Labour-type sort of economic strategy that he's put together. I mean, do you have some sympathy? I mean, he says that, look, there are going to be some cracks. There, in this system, it's never going to be perfect.
Well, of course, this situation is a challenge for any government. And, I don't tend to engage with personalities or individuals. What I want to get right is the policy. And obviously, Labour has sought to be a constructive opposition during this period of crisis. And as I said before, I have acknowledged when the government has taken on board those measures that need to be put into place, particularly that support for young unemployed people that we were calling for really a very long time. So, I'm not going to say that everything that the Chancellor has done has been wrong, quite the opposite. We pushed for a number of elements of it. But I think now really is a crunch time. Now's a crunch time when we can see the impact of that withdrawal of support across the board at the same time on employment levels. Okay. And I think we need to have a longer term approach to this. We know what the long term impact of unemployment is on individuals. It can reduce their earning capacity by around a fifth in many, many cases. That means less tax ultimately being paid into the government's coffers. And it's very, very bad for the areas where those unemployed people are concentrated. So I do think that the Chancellor and government need to be doing more to prevent this wave in unemployment.
So what about the cost of all that, though? Because, the furlough scheme is already costing billions, isn't it? You're proposing there an extension to it, which is going to cost even more. How would you be paying for this? Because we're either going to have higher taxes or austerity. There has been the suggestion of the wealth tax. Keir Starmer had talked about, we certainly support the principle those with the broadest shoulders should bear the greatest burden. So what would your plans be for making sure that all this can be paid for?
So just very quickly, at the start of your question, you said that we were calling for an extension of the furlough scheme. As I said before, we need a targeted continuation of that wage support. Now, yes, that would cost money. Of course it would do. But as we've just been talking about, the Chancellor has just said that he can afford up to potentially £9 billion to go to every employer who has used the furlough scheme. So this really is a question about where that money is targeted. But then when it comes to dealing with the costs of this, first of all, the really critical thing that we need to do in the short to medium term is to get our economy growing again. When we do that, we get more people paying tax. We get ultimately more tax being paid as well because people will be paying consumption taxes. That is the way to get a handle on any increase in the debt.
So it doesn't sound like you've got much of a specific plan, though, to be paying all of this back.
Sorry, I was just going to say that is a sensible strategy while we are in a low interest rate environment. And we really mustn't be damaging the overall economic capacity of our country. If we do that, then we'll restrict our ability actually to deal with debt into the future. Now, we've made very clear that, if we do see that rise in interest rates that is feared, then clearly action will need to be taken. But what will need to happen is, above all, that those low and middle income earners who effectively paid the price of the crisis after the global financial crash, they must not then be the ones who pay the cost of this crisis. We need to make sure that we have a fair solution at the time when a contribution is required. But just to be crystal clear, that really should not be now. Government should be now focused on growing the economy. That is the most sustainable thing to be doing right now, and it will keep the costs of the crisis lower. You'll have fewer people needing to access unemployment support and so on and so forth. That's what government should be doing now, not really talking about tax distribution. They should be focused on growth.